séance.
I call the meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 142 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Accounts.
Place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Before we begin, I'd like to ask all in-person participants to read the guidelines written on the updated cards on the table. These measures are in place to help prevent audio and feedback incidents and to protect the health and safety of all participants, including and especially our interpreters. You'll also notice a QR code in the card which links to a short awareness video. A reminder to all in-person and online that for the safety of our interpreters, it is very important that your microphone is muted when you're not speaking. I know that can be a bit of a challenge when you're on Zoom, but when you finish your question, if you could please mute yourself, it would be greatly appreciated. Merci à tous pour votre coopération.
Thanks to everyone for your cooperation.
Conformément à l'article 108.3G du règlement, le comité d'Europe.
Pursuant to Standing Order 108.3, the committee is continuing its study on Report 6, Sustainable Development Technology Canada of the 2024 Reports 5 to 7 of the Auditor General of Canada.
Development Technology Canada, Casey Doyle, Board Director. Ms. Doyle, thank you for joining us today. You have up to 5 minutes for an opening remark if you'd like. And if so, then we'll turn to the round of questions, and the floor is yours for 5 minutes, please. And you're on mute, Ms. Doyle, so please take it from the top. And the floor is yours, Ms. Doyle.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon. I want to begin by acknowledging with respect that I am joining you today from my home in Coast Salish territory, specifically on the traditional lands of the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. I am appearing before your committee today as a recently appointed member of the Board of Directors of SDTC. I bring to this role over 40 years of public service experience. I have served as a deputy minister in the governments of British Columbia and Canada, and have since then acquired substantive experience in the governance of Crown agencies, serving on boards to that purpose for the provinces of Alberta and BC and the federal government. Over this time, I have served cabinet ministers across Canada's full political spectrum. Alongside former Deputy Ministers Paul Booth and Marta Morgan, I was appointed to the board on June 4th for a term of 1 year. Our small board structure aligns with a specific mandate to implement the recommendations of the Auditor General report on SDTC, implement the Minister's direction to restart funding for Canadian clean technology companies, both those previously approved for funding along with new applicants, and to transition SDTC programming and staff to the National Research Council. Our work is informed by the extensive and conclusive reviews conducted over the past year. The Auditor General's report of May 2024, the fact-finding review on employment practices by McCarthy Tétrault, and the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner's reports on 2 former Board of Directors. Our focus since day one has been to ensure strong executive oversight of all the Foundation's activities. In carrying out our mandate, we are guided by 3 principles: to uphold our fiduciary responsibilities to ensure the sound management of public funds, to ensure fairness to clean tech companies that have entered into legal agreements with SDTC in support of advancing their businesses, and to facilitate the transition of SDTC to the NRC in an orderly manner. Our first focus has been on implementing the guidance from the Auditor General's report. Of the 11 recommendations for SDTC, 10 have now been implemented. An updated contribution agreement was part of this work to incorporate enhanced oversight and reporting processes as recommended, and to reflect the transition underway. The recommendation still to be completed is number 6.29 in the report, and I quote, that SDTC should reassess projects approved during the audit period to ensure that they met the goal and objectives of the Sustainable Development Technology Fund and all its eligibility criteria. This reassessment is now underway using independent third parties that were recruited for their competence in this work, and their findings are being reported for final decision to our board. Our second mandate to restart funding for those companies that hold agreements with SDTC is advancing. We will rely on the findings of the AG report itself and third-party assessments underway, as well as new quality assurance process put in place to confirm continued compliance before dispersing funds. I can say that we're getting close to releasing our first disbursements, with priority being accorded to those companies who have submitted their documentation and have been waiting the longest. The process for approving new funding for projects has also resumed, with priority being accorded to those businesses that have been in the queue the longest and are most advanced in the reinforced due diligence process, including the review by external experts. On our third mandate, work is well underway to transition SDTC programming and staff to the NRC. Working groups between the two organizations are in place, developing detailed plans to ensure alignment on both programming and personnel. Lastly, I come to this role as a former Deputy Minister of Natural Resources Canada and Environment Canada, and am familiar with the kind of innovative companies that have been recipients of SDTC programming support. I am mindful in delivering my mandate of the importance of these hundreds of small and medium-sized businesses that are developing critical sustainable technologies. Their work contributes to Canada's economic growth and assists in achieving Canada's environmental objectives. Our focus as a new board is to deliver on our three mandates in a manner that ensures accountability, transparency, and integrity. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Doyle. We'll now begin our first round, which consists of 4 members, 6 minutes each. Mr. Perkins, you have the floor for 6 minutes, please. Mr. Perkins, before you begin, because we have a few new members here, I should just maybe let everyone know kind of how I like to run these and have run them without objection from anyone to date. Should there be any need to change, we can take this into subcommittee at some point, but I try to let members ask questions to the end of their time. I begin to nudge as you get close to the time, but then I like our witnesses to give a full, concise answer that goes beyond the time. I think this has worked well both for this committee to hear fully from the witnesses, and just a reminder to members, should you interrupt your witness, with a follow-up after your time, I immediately stop the clock and move on. So it's meant to give the witnesses time to one last crack at bat, I suppose, and it's proven to work well. I've not heard any objections. So I just want to let members know that, particularly who are new here, that as you're timing down yourselves, that as you approach it, I do allow witnesses to complete a brief answer. So Mr. Perkins, and again, I will just flag that you have 6 minutes, not 6:10. 6 minutes to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Doyle, for coming on this ongoing study into SDTC, as the public knows it, the $1 billion Liberal Green Slush Fund. So I'd like to start with a couple of basic questions, if I could, and thank you for your opening statement. You've just started to go through the process, or you're about to publish the first money or restart the funding. You mentioned the contribution agreement has been revised. Could you please table with this committee the revised contribution agreement and the one that it replaced?
Yes, we'd be happy to do that. Thanks.
Thank you. The questions I have begin with the issue of the money you're about to give. You outlined that the longest that have been waiting in the queue is sort of how you're going to do the priority. Could I ask you, in that analysis, are you determining whether or not they are any one of the companies of the 82% of transactions that the Auditor General reviewed that were conflicted? And keeping in mind that that is an issue for Parliament, that are you taking that as a factor about whether or not they should be moved up the queue or considered as the investigation is ongoing?
Thank you for that question. I'm getting a kind of a feedback from the room there. I should say that
Actually,
the very first.
Ms. Doyle, just hold on. Maybe we'll try to. I've stopped the clock here. You'll get a chance. So, is that better? Are you still picking up some audio feedback?
No, it's more when I speak.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, why don't you proceed if you find that it is very disruptive?
I will.
And similarly for the interpreters, if you pick it up as well. So, Ms. Doyle, the floor is yours, please.
Great. Thank you. I wanted to respond by saying that our very first priority for disbursements to our recipients are those companies that were found to have no conflict of interest or eligibility issues by the Auditor General. And so those will be the very first disbursements, but we are reviewing each project and going through this new disbursement assurance quality process before any payment will be made.
Here, so out of that period, there were 226 transactions the Auditor General reviewed, but that period had over 400 transactions. Have you reviewed the other 400 transactions for the conflicts and also eliminated them from the application process at this stage?
As I mentioned, one recommendation of the Auditor General that is still underway is the assessment of each project as she recommended. And so that work is being undertaken by third parties, and that work is underway right now. And we have.
My question is related to the full period of time, because the Auditor General only did a sample of that period of 226 of over 400 transactions. I would hope that you are looking at that would have piqued your curiosity as a board member with your fiduciary responsibility to ensure that all of those files and all of those applications of conflicted companies were being eliminated at this stage from consideration out of the 400, not just the ones the Auditor General named.
The recommendation of the Auditor General was to assess all projects within her audit period for eligibility. And that is the process that we have underway right now using third parties, is that every single project is being reviewed by 2 independent third parties to assess full eligibility.
Who those 2 independent third parties are?
They're consulting companies that we recruited through an RFP. I can provide you with the names of those consulting companies.
Yes, if you could, because we've had accusations from the whistleblower that the third parties that have been used to vet projects before have been conflicted with management.
We do have a reinforced conflict of interest provisions that to ensure that our contractors are not in any way in conflict of interest, sir.
Have you met with the minister since you took over this role?
I have not.
Have any of the board members that you're aware of?
No, not that I'm aware of. I believe none of us have met with.
Have you met with and you've met with the president of the NRC in planning the transition?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Prior to the freeze, SDTC published a regular update of every project since its inception that was funded on a spreadsheet that you could download from their website. When you restart funding, will you continue this practice?
I'm sorry, because I'm so recent in this role, I'm not familiar with that practice, but it sounds like the very kind of transparency that we're committed to. So yes, we could do the very same thing, yeah.
Okay. Who is the acting president of SDTC currently?
We do not have an acting president, sir. We have an acting chief operating officer.
And who is that?
That is
Zaid Rahim?
Zaid Rahim, yes.
And is Zaid Rahim operating full-time in that job right now?
Yes, he is operating full-time. Yes.
Okay, because we've been trying to get him to appear before this committee, and he has been saying he's sick and can't appear. So that's good to know. We will make another attempt to have him appear.
Sir, if I could just correct myself, he is on a medical leave
So who is
right
he?
now.
So who's doing the job?
So our CFO, Cheryl, yeah, pardon me, I just have to get Cheryl's
So your
last name.
CFO is the acting operating.
Yes,
And
is the acting COO.
okay, who's acting then in Mr. Rahim's role of VP of Investments?
I'm sorry, I don't have the list of staff in front of me. Brian Scott is the acting
Okay,
is the acting VP of Investments.
I'll come back to that in another round.
Thank you very much. Up next, Ms. Khalid, you have the floor, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Ms. Doyle, for appearing before us today. Ms. Doyle, can I just ask, just as a start, how long have you been in this role?
It's just over 4 months. We were appointed on June 4th, 2024.
And when did you first apply for this role?
I actually did not apply. I was contacted by an executive of ISED to ask if I'd have my name stand to be appointed to this board.
And why did you accept this position?
I accepted the position because I'm very familiar with SDTC in my former roles, and I believe in its mission. And I also felt that I could make a contribution.
And I realize that you've had quite an extensive resume, but do you want to walk through what your qualifications are with that makes you qualified for taking on this very significant role?
Yeah, thanks. As I mentioned, I've served as a Deputy Minister of Environment with the Government of British Columbia. I worked as the Associate Deputy Minister with Environment Canada and the Deputy Minister of Natural Resources Canada. I also served as Canada's Consul General in the Silicon Valley, where I worked with, technology companies, Canadian technology companies. Since leaving the public service, I have served on a number of Crown boards with the Alberta Energy Regulator, with BC Housing in British Columbia, Canada Energy Regulator. So I've had a fair amount of governance experience in Crowns, as well as volunteer organizations, actually.
And specifically, do you want to talk about any of that governance experience that you've had? Because I know that is quite integral to the role that you're going to play here.
Yes, I worked I was appointed to chair the Canada Energy Regulator and was in that role for 5 years prior to coming here. So my governance experience, and when I was a deputy minister, I worked with a number of Crowns, including SDTC, in fact, on governance and the work between the government and Crown agencies.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I appreciate it. Now, why do you think that the NRC is best suited to be that transition for what SDT's role has been, and why do you think it would be better for NRC out of all the government departments to take over this?
Well, it has a very long history of working with industrial sectors across the country, particularly in the area of innovation and bringing on new innovative companies. So I think it has deep expertise in technology and, of course, in science. It's the National Research Council. So particularly the IRAP program, it seems like a very good fit for the programming of SDTC.
Thank you. Now, I know the NRC and the PCO, they have previously testified at our committee saying that SDTC is working off expedited timelines in the transition that we are all trying to get to, and that transition is going well. How are you working with the NRC to ensure that transition is happening in a timely fashion? And what are some of the challenges that you may be facing with that transition?
Well, one area that I've been particularly involved in is the transitioning the programming from SDTC to NRC. So we hold hundreds of agreements with individual companies, and our goal is to ensure a seamless transition of those contracts between SDTC and the companies to NRC and the companies, as well as the intake of new applications. It's our intent to try to do this in a way that has the least impact on those that we serve, which are clean tech companies in Canada. So that's been, there's a fair, and it is being undertaken in an accelerated fashion. And so we just want to ensure that there's that the applications that we're building and ensuring a strong knowledge transfer between SDTC and NRC. And that work is going very well.
Now, in your opening remarks, you talked about recommendations as provided by the Auditor General, and that 10 out of those 12 have been implemented. Can you expand on that a little bit? What does that actually mean?
It's actually 10 of the 11. So there were 11 recommendations that the AG made that were specifically targeted to SDTC. There's been a considerable amount of work in advance of our appointment that had been undertaken in creating, reinforced diligence process. In some cases, just ensuring that the documentation was as in-depth as the processes themselves. So that work has been done. As I mentioned, there's been work on a contribution agreement with ISED to strengthen the reporting and making more explicit the provisions around conflict of interest. There is a new quality assurance process that's been developed for disbursements to ensure that recipients of funds continue to be in compliance with the eligibility, because the disbursements tend to take place over a number of years. It's actually, and we did table with this committee back in June an outline, an action plan on how the recommendations were being implemented, and so that it's been considerable, the amount of work. I would also say there's been a new independent ethics advisor that has been appointed to ensure that everyone in the organization is aware of their responsibilities when it comes to conflict of interest.
Thank you very much. Suivant, c'est Madame Sinclair Desgagnés.
Ms. Sinclair Desgagnés, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ms. Dahl, who is testifying today. I have a question for you. You mentioned in one of your answers that you were aware of the transition that had to take place to NRC.
I'm not getting my...
Okay. We'll just...
Yeah, I'm just not receiving the interpretation.
All right. There is... Hey, clerk, do you know how to... Could you provide instructions to the witness by chance? Yes, okay.
Pardon me. Yeah.
Ms. Doyle, there you will see a button at the bottom of your screen within your Zoom window, and you will see there's an icon called Interpretation. So click on this, and you will be able to select your channel, which will be English.
Yes, thank you very much. I now see it. Thank you. My apology.
Alors, Madame Doyle.
Ms. Doyle, can you hear the chair? Good. Ms. Sinclair Desgagnés, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. With all friendship, I would like that the test be done before committee starts, so we don't take time away from committee work. Ms. Doyle, you mentioned that you were aware of the transition that will take place with NRC. Am I correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Parfait.
Perfect. We heard several testimonies that were contradictory concerning staff members who will be transferred to NRC. One of the most convincing testimonies said that employees who will be transferred are employees, staff members are not executives. The entire executive team will not be transferred to NRC. Am I correct?
I'm not, there's no decision that has been made around the employees being transferred to the NRC at this point. So I can't really give you a conclusive answer yet because those decisions are still to be made.
Pourtant, on a quand même entendu des témoignages.
But we heard testimonies from people saying that executive members will not be transferred. All those holding senior level positions, but staff members would have secure position. The minister had promised that everyone will be transferred. And then the deputy minister and the witness who came to this committee, the witnesses, said that everyone except the executive will be transferred. But now you're saying no decision has been made. That is strange.
Yes, I am familiar with some of the testimony that's been made at this committee, but I can tell you that as the board, we have no direction or mandate around who is to be transferred, and that we are working with the National Research Council. But the decision on transferring personnel, the final decision is yet to be made.
D'accord. Quand est-ce qu'elle va être prise?
Very well. When would that decision be made? It's surprising that after 4 months after this entire saga, no decision has not been made and the board is not aware. Can you tell me when the decision will be made? When it's made, will it be communicated at least to this committee?
Yes, and I can certainly provide to the committee like a timeline on that when we are moving in an accelerated fashion. But we haven't got down to the point of actually determining exactly, which personnel will be transferred to NRC. But it's our intent to transfer as many as possible.
Parce que ce transfert-là.
That transfer should take place by the end of this year. This is October. We were told that the transfer had to take place this year, and we still do not know who is going to be transferred. So some staff members who will not be transferred will not be warned. This is very vague, or is it that you don't have the answer? And this is a pity for someone who is a board member.
Yes, we will provide to the committee that information. And I can assure you that we are very advanced in our workings with the NRC. And ensuring alignment between the two organizations. There is no deadline by the end of this calendar year. Our aim is to have this done within our appointment of 1 year.
Bon, je vais passer à un autre sujet. Vous avez mentionné.
Let me change topics. Earlier, in your opening remarks, you said you were still reviewing projects, and according to the recommendation of the OAG 6.29, the response from SDTC to this recommendation was a partial one. What was written was that senior officials and staff members are intelligent enough to be able to determine which projects are eligible or not. But what you're saying is that you are following or respecting the recommendations. So there's inconsistency here. Are you changing the response from Sustainable Development Technology Canada, the response to the OAG's report, or are you saying that the response was just a partial acceptance of the recommendation?
As I mentioned, we're in the process of implementing Auditor General's recommendation 6.29.
Mais Madame Doyle, elle a été partiellement.
But Ms. Doyle, it was only partially accepted. So, to say it clearly, it was not really accepted. The response from SDTC was that it was simply a partial acceptance, but you're saying it's being implemented. So this is contrary to what we know.
One thing I should, just advise is the response to the Auditor General's report was prepared in advance of our appointment as a board. When we were appointed as a board, it was the very day that the report came out, and so we had no input into that. We as a board are implementing the recommendations of the Auditor General as written. So we are undertaking a review of every project, and we're using independent third parties.
Mais c'est très, très pertinent. Donc, vous avez eu des conversations sur là-dessus.
But this is very relevant. You had conversations about that. I imagine that you saw the responses provided by SDTC. You singled out that issue because it's important. It's one of the most important recommendations of the OAG's report, which was partially accepted. And now you're saying that you came after the responses were written and you're accepting the recommendation. So did you have any discussions with people who accepted it partially for it to be implemented, or you're accepting it before us using big words, but we are not really sure it's going to be done or implemented within SDTC?
As I mentioned in my opening remarks, we are implementing that recommendation as it was written using independent third parties. I
pardon?
can't speak to the
Bref question, parce
partial,
qu'il y a beaucoup de temps de
partial
traduction.
acceptance. Yeah.
Juste une petite brève question.
Et voilà, non, je vous ai donné encore une. Suivant, c'est Mich.
Mr. Desjardins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Doyle, for being present in our committee today. I was pleased to see in your opening remarks that you're committed to 3 overall priorities that I find are critical to the reestablishment both of public trust, but also to make clear the fiduciary responsibility that lies between taxpayers and institutions. The Auditor General in her release of this audit quoted, and I quote in her news release, quote, like all organizations funded by Canadian taxpayers, Sustainable Development Technology Canada has a responsibility to conduct its business in a manner that is transparent, accountable, and compliant with legislation, said Ms. Hogan, continuing, quote, our findings show that when this doesn't happen, it's not always clear that funding decisions made on behalf of Canadian taxpayers were appropriate or justified. As you know, Ms. Doyle, there was serious concerns related to the breach of public trust under issues of conflict of interest and board and executive mismanagement. These 2 issues are incredibly challenging for what is an earnest policy, a policy that's intended to support small and medium-sized businesses in Canada, a program and policy that's intended to ensure that innovation, that Canada could actually make stuff and produce stuff and do stuff, not only to help our economy, but to help our environment. This is something that young people across the country, people who love the outdoors, people who cherish what we've inherited in our country really value, but are finding it difficult to square the circle between what has been a very disappointing and extreme level of corruption that we've been investigating through the SDTC process. When it became apparent that this issue was so extremely mismanaged, the minister rightfully did disband SDTC and has begun the process of transferring that work to NRC, which is where we find you, Ms. Doyle. Get a phone call from the government, said, we're in trouble. We need you to help us rebuild a system that has largely left Canadians now both nervous and mistrustful. It's an incredible challenge, and I really appreciate you accepting this role. But of course, as you know, given the gravity and severity of this issue, we have some very difficult questions I hope you can provide us some clarity on. Can you please describe what specific responsibilities in managing the transition to NRC that you hold?
Well, as I mentioned, we're a 3-person board, so we pretty well operate sharing all the responsibilities. I have taken a particular interest in the area of the restart of funding as a member of the board. But we are providing a very strong executive oversight of the organization, so we work very closely together.
And Ms. Doyle, are you paid by the Canadian taxpayer?
Yes, I am.
And what is your compensation for being a member of the board? Any salaries, honorariums, per diems?
Yes, we are paid a per diem or like for at 1 day or half day, and it's aligned with the same as a kind of a lower end of the deputy minister's salary.
And what's that?
It works out to being around about $750 for a half a day's work, or $1,500 a day.
Thank you very much. Have you had to recuse yourself from any discussions during your time on the board? And if so, why?
I have not, and I can say that I have no conflict of interest when it comes to, my own investments or connections or relationships with clean tech companies in Canada.
Have you ever had conflict of interest training prior to your appointment to the board or during your tenureship on the board, though, so far?
We did, as a board, we met with the Office of the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner to ensure that we really understood our obligations under the Act. As well, SDTC now has an independent ethics advisor, and I met with that individual to go through all my own personal holdings to ensure no conflict of interest before taking the assignment.
Thank you so much for that answer, which I think would lead into this next question for clarity purposes. Did any companies of which you were an owner, partial owner, member of a board, receive any SDTC funding at any point in time?
No.
Did any companies in which your family or friends owned were members of the board receive SDTC funding?
No.
Thank you very much, Ms. Doyle. And I do appreciate you answering these questions in earnest. It does make our work much more valuable in this committee. Speaking to now a point that you raised, which I was happy to hear, which was your focus on recommendation of the Auditor General 6.29, which largely deals with recovery. This is something that we're aligned with, actually, Ms. Doyle. It's something that I'm very passionate about, is trying to ensure that any instance where there was a conflict of interest or potential mismanagement at the board level that would have resulted in any funding agreement with potentially ineligible projects should be recovered. The Canadian taxpayer should get that money back for any illegitimate projects that were deemed acceptable at that time. There was an organization that we had brought in at one point that was members of the Project Review Committee, which I'm sure you're familiar with, is a function of SDTC that helped to review some of this information. They had claimed at that point that, well, at least the Auditor General in her report suggests that this quasi-approval board, at least in the partial acceptance of 6.29, was the reason why some projects were deemed ineligible. This is something that I find largely unacceptable. Do you believe we should recover funds for ineligible projects, as I do?
I believe that where we find any evidence of wrongdoing, and we will, as a board, take action to recover those funds.
Thank you very much. Beginning the second round, Mr. Cooper, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Ms. Doyle, just to clarify an answer you provided to a question posed by Mr. Perkins, the reassessment process that is now underway is taking into account all of the projects that were reviewed during the time period of the Auditor General's report, not just the sample of the Auditor General. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Can you provide the assurance that once the reassessment process is completed, that no companies that were involved in conflicts of interest involving board members will receive a further cent from the taxpayer through SDTC?
As I mentioned, we are implementing the Auditor General's recommendation, and we're reviewing every single project on an individual basis. And if we find any evidence of wrongdoing on the part of the recipient, as the legal agreements exist between SDTC and the recipients, then the board will take action on recovery.
And take action on recovery and bar such companies from receiving further funding?
Yes, I would imagine that if there was any finding of wrongdoing, that would disqualify them from future agreements with
For that. Now,
SDTC.
you spoke about a reinforced contribution agreement that is now in place. Pursuant to that reinforced contribution agreement, are there any projects that would now be eligible for funding that were ineligible under the previous contribution agreements, but had nonetheless been approved by the former corrupt SDTC board?
That might be the case. You know, the Act and the contribution agreement had not kept pace with changes in the technology space that we are focused on in clean tech. So there is a possibility with the new contribution agreement that, it was recommended by the Auditor General that we clarify language around eligibility. That I would say is a possibility.
I apologize to interrupt you, Ms. Doyle, and I thank you for that, but I raise it because when the whistleblower appeared before this committee 2 weeks ago, he said that it was more than a possibility. He said that with respect to the reinforced contribution agreement, that it, quote, goes back and retroactively allows for the majority of those ineligible projects to be considered eligible, a majority of ineligible projects. That seems to me to be concerning. It seems to me to be concerning that we have $58 million of money that improperly went out the door, according to the Auditor General, and instead of cleaning up the corruption and mismanagement at SDTC, what is now in fact happening pursuant to the so-called reinforced contribution agreement is that the minister and ISED and the board at SDTC are changing the rules retroactively to invalidate mismanagement and corruption.
Right now, the process is underway to assess the eligibility. So I'm not sure how anyone could speak as the outcome of that process. But I can just give you one example that in the new contribution agreement, we now have much more clear definitions around the technology readiness levels. They hadn't been as clearly defined in the former contribution agreement, and that had posed a challenge around the Auditor General's review of what readiness level was a particular project when it came to its eligibility. So in some cases, the language is now much clearer with clearer definitions of what we mean by the TRLs, as they refer to, technology readiness levels.
Thank you. I'll move on to our next member. Ms. Yip, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thank you for coming on board. Ms. Doyle, how is SDTC implementing the Auditor General's recommendations?
Well, there's a lot in the Auditor General's report, as I imagine you all know. And we did table an action plan here with this committee in June, outlining the intention around the implementation. But I think, there has been the implementation of and determination of new processes, such as the quality assurance process related to disbursements. There has been new training of staff, or recent training and ongoing training of staff around their obligations when it comes to, for instance, conflict of interest. There's no new reporting that is in place. For instance, we at the board are provided with monthly reports of any conflict of interest that has been identified by the staff. So it's reporting, it's new processes in place, it's training. We have, as I mentioned, a new ethics advisor There's a new way of recording the minutes of the board. So it's considerable, the level of implementation, and 10 of the 11 recommendations of the Auditor General's report have now been implemented.
You mentioned an action plan. How is that progressing? And what are some of the actions in the plan?
Yes, the action plan is now the action plan, we did table it here in June at this committee, and it is now, as I mentioned, except for the very large recommendation around the reassessment of eligibility of all the projects during the audit period, all the other recommendations have now been implemented, and it speaks to just really enhanced diligence, enhanced reporting, strengthened documentation. There's really quite a significant number of improvements that have been made to implement those recommendations.
How do you see the transition into the NRC increasing oversight and accountability at SDTC?
Well, it will be a different governance structure. You know, there will be the programming of SDTC will form part of the National Research Council. And so there will be subject to more in line with the department of government as opposed to an independent agency as SDTC is as a foundation. And therefore they'll be subject to, really the rules and the financial requirements of more along the lines of a line department.
Were you given any instructor by the Minister of Innovation or ISED as part of this transition?
We were given a formal mandate, which I referred to in my opening comments. That was provided to us in a letter from the minister. But we haven't had any other direction. So that's our laser focus, is the delivery of those three elements of our mandate: implementing the AG's report, restarting funding, and transitioning SDTC into NRC.
So did the renewed contribution agreement make this clear?
Yes, it does. It allows us to operate in a way where we are in compliance during this transition period, and it clarifies in a number of instances, the reporting requirements, for instance, with to ISED.
Has SDTC funding been unblocked yet? Is the board currently approving and dispersing funds?
We are very close to issuing our first disbursements, but we have not yet started that process. But I would say that we are within just a matter of weeks now, after the board's been in place for 4 months. Yeah.
If you have a very short question, or I can come back to you later.
Well, why is there, in terms of the speed of the disbursement, is there a reason?
Again, it was important for us to, as a new board, to ensure that we had all of the quality assurance processes in place, and there was a number of steps that we needed to go through, like in terms of our own due diligence before restarting funds.
Et voilà, merci beaucoup. Suivant, encore une fois.
Thank you. Ms. Sinclair Degagné, 2 minutes, 30 seconds. Thank you, Chair. You, Ms. Doyle, to follow up on what you just said, you said in a few weeks, initial payments may be made to eligible companies that should have received disbursements for a few months now or for a year at least. All eligible companies, will they start receiving money in a few weeks or only a proportion? And if that's the case, what proportion of companies will receive disbursements?
These payments, they are not initial payments, but they are payments that are being dispersed according to the calendar that was set up when these projects were approved. And as I mentioned, the very first round of disbursements will go to those companies that have already been reviewed by the Auditor General and found to have no eligibility issues or conflict of interest issues. So that'll be the very first round. And I can, as we get more certainty around our schedule, we could provide that information. I can't say with any exactitude when we will get to the others. As I mentioned, the Auditor General had recommended, and we've accepted that recommendation, to review every single project to ensure that they are in compliance
Parfait, oui.
with.
Merci, merci. Mon temps est limité.
Thank you. My time is limited. In terms of proportion, you're saying those that were assessed by the Auditor General. So the consulting agencies that have been reviewing the projects, what are they doing exactly? Because these consulting firms normally should progress. We were told that work was underway already in the spring. The consulting firms have been there for a while. Could you please send us the timetable that is systematically submitted with every response to the call for tenders? For example, if somebody responded to the call for proposals and was accepted, and then you request, could you send us the timetable for those assessments?
Yes, I could take that question under advisement and provide more information. But can I just add that we did not start this process until the completion of the Auditor General's report. So it was only as the new board, that we turned our mind to implementing this recommendation. Then we went through the RFP. We selected independent consulting companies that are now reviewing against the eligibility as recommended under, I think it's recommendation 6.29. So it is that process that is underway now. And it's each project is going back to the original documentation that the project submitted and looking at every element of eligibility for the SDTC fund.
Merci beaucoup. Une petite question, Madame Seclair?
Thank you. Do you have a small question, or will you wait for the next turn? Okay, thank you.
Mr. Desjardins,
Mr. Deleger.
please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Ms. Doyle, the minister's quoted, or I'd like to quote the minister at the very least, says, quote, "For their part, SDTC employees will be offered employment with the NRC. Employees at SDTC have gone through a difficult and challenging period. Their dedication and hard work will ensure the continued success of our clean tech startups." That was from the minister in relation to some serious concerns about job security for some of the country's best professionals in this space. As you know, the professional services and technological sector is a difficult sector to second talent for. We've heard that in this committee before from multiple audits, that we're seeing a lot of companies really suffering from an inability to recruit properly. This is something that I think is quite serious, because if we don't have these professionals within the public service, it leaves it to groups like GC Strategies that we had to deal with in the past, and I'm sure you're aware of, and the tremendous bleeding of public funds to these random private tiny firms that can manipulate the public system in order to get more funding. My preference, which I think is the preference of many Canadians, is to have good public servants that know how to do the job and aren't skimming off the top. That is what we need in order to make our country's public sector work more valuable, but also to deliver more value for dollar for taxpayers. That being said, since you took this role, have you spoken to the minister or the deputy minister in regards to his commitment to see employees at SDTC transfer to NRC?
I have not spoken to the minister since taking this appointment. We have been in touch and spoken to representatives of ISED, the executive of ISED. And I agree with you, and the board agrees with you, that we want to retain the deep expertise that's been developed within SDTC around sustainable technologies. So that's something that we are committed to.
Have they been offered jobs?
The job offers have not yet come. We've had a number of, like, we had to start with the information exchange because, as you could imagine, the classifications and job titles, et cetera, are very different between SDTC and NRC. So that work has been ongoing, and we have a very good team we're working with at the NRC. And so I don't have a date of when the job offers will be made, but everything is kind of working towards that as an objective. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Desley. You're right at the end. I'll add a little bit of time to your next round. Turning now to Mr. Brock, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, Ms. Doyle. Thank you for your attendance. Minister Champagne on June the 4th, 2024, issued a press release, and I'm going to quote from that release. He said, effective immediately, SDTC will also resume funding under a reinforced contribution agreement with ISED for eligible projects in a sector vital to our country's economy and clean growth transition. In line with the Auditor General's findings, my department will enhance oversight and monitoring of funding during the transition period. Now, did I hear you correctly in stating that since your appointment in and around June of this year, you have not funded any projects as of date?
We were appointed the very same day as that press release.
There's been no funding since that date?
No, there has been no disbursements made because there needed to be certain recommendations of the Auditor General.
Yeah, thank you.
Implemented. Yeah.
That's fine, ma'am. You confirmed on a number of occasions you have yet to speak to Minister Champagne, correct?
That's correct.
Have you spoke to the Deputy Minister?
Yes, we've had a discussion with the Deputy Minister, and we have other members of the ISED executive who attend each of our board meetings for a period of time for exchange of information and updates.
Okay. So you're sharing information. Are they providing an oversight and monitoring of projects that you are about to fund? Have they weighed in? Have they made an assessment about the appropriateness of that funding?
We have a regular reporting to ISED, and it's under the new contribution agreement. And financial reporting is going back and forth between ISED and SDTC. When it comes to the actual eligibility of the projects, that is our responsibility as the board. And so we've put this process in place, which I've referred to a number of times.
Who are you talking to at ISED besides the Deputy Minister?
We are speaking with the Assistant Deputy Minister and members of his team, I believe. Yes.
Apply this committee with all those names?
Yes, we could.
You mentioned you're reporting to ISED. Do you know specifically who you are reporting to?
We report in, and I mean, we don't, as a board, report. We're appointed by the minister and serve at the pleasure of the government, but we report. Our reporting goes in to the deputy minister. Yeah.
Part of the difficulty in the previous rendition of the board of SDTC was information that we learned that the assistant deputy minister of ISED actually sat in on each and every board meeting, had his eyes and ears on all the funding that was conflicted, all the funding that went to Liberal insiders, and whether or not that was passed on up the chain to Minister Champagne still to this day remains a mystery, hence the scandal. You obviously have had a number of board meetings, smaller in nature, since your appointment. Has the assistant deputy minister sat in on those meetings?
The new contribution agreement specifies exactly the nature of the connection between the board and ISID. A member of an assistant deputy minister or his or her representative attends one portion of the board for the strict purpose of exchange of updates, and then leaves the board, so they are not present during any of our board business.
How on earth does that enhance oversight when that particular assistant deputy minister merely receives an update and is not privy to ensuring that all the actions and all the decisions you are making are in accordance with the updated contribution agreement? That was the whole purpose behind the old contribution agreement, that there would be some degree of oversight.
Thank you, Mr. Brock.
Am I hearing there's no oversight?
Mr. Doyle, you have the floor, please.
Yeah. The oversight is very well documented now in the new contribution agreement, and it is through a series of reporting. But as an independent agency, as specified under the Act, that the oversight is not done by having a member of the ISED as sitting in on the board, but rather through the regular reporting, both financial and program reporting, to the department.
Thank you very much. Suivant, c'est M. Drouin pour 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Well, for appearing before this committee. I've noticed that you've obviously have extensive experience, both serving in government and outside of government. I noticed that you were deputy minister at Natural Resources. I think you mentioned that from 2006 to 2010. Just with regards to the contribution agreement and just in general, with your experience serving in government, when we talk about oversight, ISED's interest is whether or not the board is respecting the contribution agreement that you have signed, but not necessarily getting involved in the minutiae and day-to-day operations. Is that correct?
Yes, I'd say that's correct.
Okay, because I was just I was worried because I do have lots of organizations back home who have signed various different contribution agreements with various departments, and they would be quite concerned if the minister or political staff or the deputy minister was involved in their day-to-day operations. Obviously, there are reporting mechanisms. It doesn't mean that there is no oversight. It just means that the contribution agreement that you have signed with the said department, whether or not you are respecting that legal entente, if I can say that, with that said department, correct?
Yes, I think that is the essence of the contribution agreement, is to ensure accountability to the government.
Okay, and if you're not respecting that, obviously the department has to step in and say, hey, you said you were going to spend X, Y, Z on the particular mandate of the program or the funding agreement that we have signed, and you're not respecting that. Therefore, we will not repay you or not allow you to declare those particular expenses with our department. But I want to move on from that. Your mandate, the board's mandate, you said you're 3 board members. You have, what's the mandate of the board actually? Like 3, I know you've mentioned that you're currently looking at, through a third party, looking at current contribution agreements with those companies that were funded, but what else do you have to do within the mandate of that particular, the new board?
The new board, the minister gave us a very defined mandate. It's 3 and an appointment of 1 year, which is unusual in its brevity. So we have, our mandate is to implement the Auditor General's report, to restart funding, which had been put on pause, and thirdly, to ensure an orderly transition of the organization into the National Research Council.
Okay.
That's our mandate.
Okay, and obviously there's been some concerns with conflict of interest, and I want to dive into that. The new contribution agreement that you've signed with ISED, how does it differ from the previous one with regards to conflict of interest? Because I know we talk about real, perceived, or potential conflicts of interest, and how are you as a board managing that?
Well, has been a fair amount of work and a new conflict of interest code within SDTC. We as a board receive monthly reports of any declaration of conflict of interest. We also, ICID under the new contribution agreement also receives regular reporting of any declaration of conflict of interest. There has been the appointment of a new ethics advisor at SDTC, and there has been training, quite extensive training that's been implemented. So I'd say there's been a much more robust conflict of interest regime in place. And that applies not only to staff, but also to contractors and anyone doing work for the foundation.
And then some of my colleagues asked about your appointment, June 2024. There was a press release. 3 board members were appointed. You've talked about a third party being involved in terms of reviewing the current contribution agreements that are currently in place. When was that RFP given to that third party? Or when was that announced, the award of the third party for review? And I'm just trying to determine whether it's long.
It was one of the AG's recommendation. It took us about 6 weeks, I think. And so it was sometime, I would say in late July, that the independent consultants were retained. Yeah.
Okay. And is there an end time particular to that, to the fact that they need to complete all of the reviews that were listed in the particular RFP? Or is this get to the bottom of this and take as long as you want?
No, we do have our end time that we made a commitment in the action plan that the action plan to implement is the end of December 2024.
Thank
is
you.
to have all of that review complete.
Thank you very much, Mr. Doyle. Beginning our third round, Mr. Perkins, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to ask the witness, if I could, the SDTC had created something called accelerators. Are those companies that were accelerators, project reviews, still in place?
Yeah, thanks for that question. No new applications will be considered under, and the accelerators came under a stream called the ecosystem funding stream. And so one decision the board has taken is to cease funding of the accelerators or under the ecosystem and to not accept any further applications.
So I'm going to go through a scenario, and I appreciate hearing that, to make sure that you're eliminating this from the whole process. Because former chair of SDTC, Annette Bicharon, came to that stream for the Bicharon Center, seeking a total of $6.8 million for the Bicharon Center, which was one of those accelerators, which she established at Cape Breton University. That got to the investment committee, which your now acting chief operating officer was involved in, and we have emails from him in his role as VP of investments, which said, obviously that the conflict was even too much for that group to accept, and it was rejected, but committed an email that SDT staff would help find the Bicharon Center money elsewhere. So the result of that is that on June 9th, 2022, ACOA granted $2 million to the Bicharon Center, and I said another $2.5 million. And then in September of 2023, while ICED was investigating SDTC, their regional development agency, ACOA, gave yet another $1 million. And then on September 19th, 2023, the industry department gave them another $3.1 million. So that's a total of almost $9 million of taxpayer money that went, that the whistleblower said staff were involved in trying to find funding for that center elsewhere. And they confirmed that that was a common practice, that staff were tasked with finding other money for these sometimes rejected and sometimes accepted projects in other government departments. Have you stopped the practice of staff being the government relations and slush fund management of the Government of Canada for either rejected or accepted projects on that? It is not SDTC's role to act as the in-house application process for other government departments, is it?
As I've mentioned, Mr. Chair, we have a very particular mandate, and that mandate is to, as I said, go through those three things. But we have, as I mentioned, the ecosystem funding stream has been discontinued, and so
have you curtailed the process of staff acting on behalf of companies that apply to find money in other government departments? And you were a deputy minister in other government departments. So have you stopped that? That seems to me not to be the mandate that Parliament gave the foundation.
I'm not familiar with any practice like that being undertaken.
Well, it means it hasn't stopped then. I'll move to my next thing. The order of the House of Commons was that unredacted documents during that audit period be turned over to the law clerk of the House of Commons. And SDTC, as I understand it, has not fully complied with that. In fact, put in redacted documents. And the Speaker ruled a point of privilege against the House, which we're debating as we speak in the House. Are you, as a board member, ensuring that you comply with the order of the House of Commons to put unredacted documents into the law clerk?
We had directed, and I'm quite certain that it was implemented, that all thousands and thousands of unredacted documents were provided to the law clerk. None of the documents that were provided by SDTC were redacted.
But the full order, according to the law clerk, has not been complied with because not all the documents have come yet.
Well,
That's
the documents
in a letter
that were
from the law clerk to the Speaker.
Our own obligations, I believe, have been fulfilled. At SDTC, there were a number of other agencies that were involved. In fact, I think almost every part of government was covered by that request.
Thank you very much. Up next is Mr. Erskine Smith. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Ms. Doyle. I just want to make sure we start with, so you've implemented 10 of the 12 recommendations. When do you foresee implementing all of the recommendations?
Yeah, the only one that is outstanding is this reassessment of eligibility, and our target to have that complete is the end of December 2024.
Excellent.
Just given it's a lot of work, you know.
Yeah, it sounded like a lot of work when I read the AG's recommendations. One of the challenges here is there was a conflict of interest mess in terms of procedures being followed, but a lot of that seemed to hinge based upon what I've been able to glean from the evidence, and the record is a lot hinged on particular lawyers involved in advice. And I just want to be clear, the lawyer who was offering that advice at the time, is he still involved in any way with the organization?
No, he's not in any way involved anymore, no.
And is anyone involved? So in terms of the concerns that have been raised, the biggest concern from, again, what I've been able to see is, I know there's a lot of grandstanding and political theater to this, but there was a bundled approval of COVID payments to COVID-related payments, emergency payments to a series of companies that had been previously approved for funding, and there was a bundled approval. And again, the lawyer suggested that a recusal was not necessary. I think that was incorrect advice in the language of the ethics commissioner. Anyone involved in that approval process at the time, is anyone still involved in the board?
You know, my understanding is that the main person involved in that was the CEO, and she, as you know, is gone. And the lawyer himself is no longer providing advice.
So anyone who is subject to any concerning conflict or any allegation of conflicts, they're no longer involved.
Yeah, that's my understanding. Yeah.
Okay, and this business with the RCMP, my understanding there's a privilege question in the House right now, and the idea is Parliament's demanded documents to turn them over to the RCMP. Honestly, I read the Ethics Commissioner's report from July, and the Ethics Commissioner finds 2 violations of the Act. Again, the largest violation, in one case it was an abstention instead of a recusal. Okay, that's certainly not criminal. A violation of the rules, the ethics rules in the commissioner's view, and rightly so, but not anywhere close to a criminal standard of behavior. The finding 2 was in relation to this bundled approval, and in the language of the ethics commissioner. Said that the chairperson, while the original payments to NR Store were approved before she became chairperson of SDTC, on these occasions, following incorrect advice, she did not recuse herself. Again, that is nowhere near criminal behavior. So I'm a bit confused. Has there been any communication as between the RCMP and the board to suggest that they're taking any investigation seriously?
No, there has not been. We have had no communication, and the RCMP has not been in touch with us at all. And I understand, from that there was a letter that the AG prepared on July 10th of this year to the clerk of the House of Commons that indicated that in situations where her office is of the view that activities may be of a criminal nature, they promptly inform the RCMP. She had not done that in the case of this audit.
Of course not, because anyone of a sound mind who is reading the evidentiary record wouldn't think for an instant that this is a criminal matter, unless you're a conservative. Thanks. That's my time.
You still have another couple seconds if you like. Are you good?
Well, I think, Chair, honestly, this seems like an endless, an endless series of meetings for something that we know what happened. We know that now the board has concluded 10 of 12 recommendations, and they're working on the rest of it. This thing's being transitioned to NRC, and no one who is subject to any of the problems is still involved. I guess we can have another dozen meetings, but I don't know what we're doing here.
Suivant, c'est Madame Sinclair Desgagnés.
Miss Sinclair Desgagnés, 2 minutes, 30 seconds. You stated that you will take under advisement information you are going to seek concerning consulting firms that have been retained. What did you mean exactly?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question? I just didn't get it with the...
I asked you a question about the consulting firms that were retained. You told my colleagues that some firms had been retained. At the end of June, I asked that you give us the timeline that was in the call for proposals in response to the call for tenders, and you said you take it under advisement. What do you mean by that? Are you going to give us those documents, yes or no?
Yes, we'd be happy to provide you with the information around the specifics of the RFP, the date that it was issued, when
Non,
it
c'est pas ce que
closed.
j'ai demandé.
Yeah.
J'ai demandé la réponse des...
No, that is not I asked. I was talking about the responses from the consulting firms, the responses to the RFP. So they state their timelines when they are responding. They indicate the number of companies to be assessed. The timeline is provided. And they state the number of companies that will be assessed and how much time it's going to be taken. It all is very clear. I don't know why you can't answer that question. If consultants commit to do work during a certain number of months, it's normally done.
Yes, and we'd be happy to provide you with that timeline.
Bon. Enfin,
Very well. Finally, I got the answer to my previous question. Now I can move on to other questions. Now, did you listen to the testimony of witness number 1?
I'm sorry.
Donc, la réponse est non. Le témoin numéro 1 et le témoin...
So the answer is no. Witness number one was the whistleblower. The whistleblower. He was witness number one.
I had some summary of that witness's testimony before your committee, yes.
Est-ce que vous en avez pensé quelque chose?
What do you think about it?
I was not appointed to reflect on or to second guess what happened in the past. We have a very distinct mandate, and so I don't have any comments on what a whistleblower said about something that happened many, many months ago at SDTC.
Ben, donc vous n'avez pas écouté.
So you did not listen to the testimony, so the notes provided, and therefore not very pertinent. He talked about what happened in the past, what is still happening now. And there's something that is really lacking in this. Apologies for this whistleblower. These people are very brave and they are ready to report on any dangerous activities that will be harmful to the taxpayers, and the bloc has submitted a bill for their protection. You, as a member of the board for SDTC, would you finally apologize to the whistleblower, listen to what he had to say, and correct any errors made in the past, the reason for which you were employed or recruited?
As a new board of SDTC, our focus is on moving this organization forward. And we have been given a very distinct mandate, and which we are implementing now. And that is going to be our focus for the term of our appointment.
Et voilà, vous aurez
Your time is up. You'll have another round. Your time is up. Mr. Desjardins, 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Ms. Doyle, I do want to return to the topic of the very valuable workforce that exists in STTC, the people, the everyday folks who are trying to show up and contribute to their country, offer innovation and offer their skills in what is a very large emerging sector. Canada, I do believe, can become a global leader when it comes to the development of innovative technology that supports our economic goals, but also supports our sustainability goals. These are things that are important to any 21st century country that's needing to actually create solutions moving forward. Part of enabling the support for these workers in their transition from SDTC to what will be a new entity, there's concerns that I have coming from labor in particular that revolve around the treatment of workers at SDTC. You're aware, Ms. Doyle, likely of a report internal to the government related or by the name McCarthy Tetro, an internal investigation by a third party to investigate the claims by workers and the conditions of workers within SDTC. There was a credible challenge and a credible concern that workers raised by way of a whistleblower. This whistleblower, known to this committee as Witness One, claimed at that time that there was severe instances of misogyny, homophobia, instances of racism where one employee was asked to remove their hijab, very serious instances of discrimination. It was the response of the government when hearing these concerns to have a third-party review, which I agree with. I think that was the right call by any reasonable government, by any reasonable party to suggest, yeah, we need to shed some light on this circumstance. Light is the best disinfectant. Let's get transparency. Let's get truth. Let's bring some of these employees forward. The biggest concern I have related to that was the fact that there was NDAs, non-disclosure agreements signed by those workers prior to that commission and disabling their ability to be able to represent their truths. Will the new and the new creation that comes out of SDTC respect workers? Will it respect their right to unionize? Will it respect if they choose to be represented by the Public Service Alliance of Canada? And will those workers have real protections moving forward?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And you do refer to the McCarthy Tetro report, which is like one of the foundational pieces that we as a board have used in moving forward. When the personnel of STTC transition into the NRC. As you know, that is a unionized workplace as part of the more core public service of Canada. So that is part of what the work that's going on now is just how to integrate all the individuals in SDTC into that workplace. But they certainly will enjoy the same benefits as anyone in the public service unions.
Thank you very much. You'll have one last opportunity, Mr. Desjardins, as well. Turning out to Mr. Cooper, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Doyle, I take it from your testimony that not 1 cent of money that improperly went out the door at the Green Slush Fund has been recovered in the 4 months that the interim board has been in place. Is that correct?
We have a process in place to review every single project on an individual basis.
I understand you have a process in place. You've explained that. And my question is just to confirm that at present, not 1 cent has actually been recovered.
Now, there's a process underway now.
Thank you. So not 1 cent has been recovered. Thank you for that. And the process that I presume you're alluding to are the consulting firms that are undertaking reassessments. Is that the process?
Yes, that's the process as recommended by the Auditor General.
And I want to just be clear in understanding what is being done through these independent consulting firms and the review that is taking place as to who's eligible and who won't be eligible. You noted more than once that the projects that will be down on the list and will be flagged and where there is wrongdoing will not be eligible, or those where the Auditor General identified, for instance, conflicts of interest. Is that correct?
Well, the process underway is reassessing every project around its eligibility.
Maybe just to help you answer, the Auditor General went through 226 of 420 projects. Of the 226 projects reviewed by the Auditor General identified 186 conflicts of interest. Based upon the sample that the Auditor General took, in which the Auditor General found 82% of projects involved conflicts of interest, when you look at the balance of the projects, there could be somewhere in the neighborhood of anywhere from 180 to 200 additional conflicts of interest that involved former Green Slush Fund board members. That's a lot of conflicts. That's a lot of wrongdoing to examine. And I just am wondering exactly what is being done and what assurance can you provide that those conflicts, that wrongdoing, is being captured? Because count me skeptical if you're telling me that some third-party consultants are coming in and are doing that work in a sufficient way.
I can assure you that the process is well underway. We're using a number of different consultancies so that we can get this work done in an accelerated fashion, and that should and where there's any instance after each review of wrongdoing, we will take action.
Of one instance, and that is the $220,000 that was improperly funneled into Annette Verscharen's company. She moved 2 motions to funnel $220,000 into a company in which she was the CEO, sole shareholder, and sole director, or majority shareholder, sole director. She has been found guilty of violating multiple sections of the Conflict of Interest Act. So there is a black and white case of wrongdoing that has been identified by the Auditor General. Has your process been initiated to recover those funds now that the Ethics Commissioner has issued a report?
That is one of the projects that is under review now. That process is.
What is there to review? What is there to be review? She has been found guilty by the ethics commissioner. So why is it, in the face of that, that the SDTC board is not immediately, through its process, taking steps to recover those funds that improperly went out the door and in a blatant conflict of interest?
Yes, and I understand that she was also the subject of a conflict of interest in ethics commissioner's report.
Thank you very much. Pardon me. Up next is Ms. Bradford. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank
Ms.
you,
Bradford.
Mr. Chair, and thank you so much, Ms. Doyle, for joining us today and giving us your testimony. So just for clarification purposes, can you tell us how many different third-party...
Start from the top again. Just gentlemen, order, please. It's Ms. Bradford. You have the floor again, and it's 5 minutes from the top if you like.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So thank you, Ms. Doyle, for attending today and for your testimony. So for clarification, can you clarify how many different third-party consultants are doing these reviews in order to expedite the process?
I believe there are 3 consultancies that have been retained.
Okay, and the aim is to have these completed by the end of December this year, is that correct?
That is correct.
And will you be able to share the results of the project reviews with this committee once available?
Yes, I think we can make those available, yes.
Okay.
And it's subject to commercial confidentiality.
Understood.
That's always kind of yeah.
Right. Now, would it be fair to say that the project reviews are happening before the former folding of the programming into the NRC so that the programming may start in a clean state once at the NRC?
Our schedule would have that complete before the programming is integrated. That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. Now, when the SDTC is folded into the NRC, at that time, is it your understanding that funding decisions will very much function in the same way as other programs under the NRC, meaning decisions are no longer happening at the board level, but by public servants instead?
That's my understanding. The NRC doesn't have a board. It's more integrated into the core public service.
Right, so hence why you only have like a 1-year term, because the goal is to have this all wrapped up and folded into the NRC 1 year from when you were appointed, which was in June of this year, correct?
That's correct.
Now, you mentioned in earlier testimony that there are new conflict of interest rules. Who is developing that? Is that the new ethics, or who's developing those?
They were developed, under the advisement of the ethics commissioner and with, input from I'm sure from ISID. So they had been, a number of those, the new code had been developed in advance of our appointment. And we also have, as I've said, now an independent ethics advisor who's providing regular advice to the board and organization.
Now, you said that these conflict of interest rules apply to staff and contractors. Do they also apply to the board members?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. I was wondering, have you been hearing from organizations and companies over the summer? Are they coming to your door for funding now that the funding has been officially unblocked?
Yes, we have heard directly from those that we hold partnership agreements with that are, feeling the stress of the funding having been paused.
Right, so that was my next question. So what position is the industry in after a year of frozen funding at SDTC? And what are you hearing from them?
Yeah, we've certainly been hearing that, there's a real interest in getting on and having the funding resume. In many cases, that means that they can then continue in terms of their own business development, because most of our companies are in the process of developing innovative technologies.
But the position is that you won't be doing any more funding until the reviews have been completed and there be no new funding done until it gets rolled into the NRC. Is that the plan?
No, as I said in my opening remarks, we're very close to resuming disbursements for projects where there's no eligibility issues as deemed in the Auditor General's report. So no, it's our intent to resume funding. We had to have the contribution agreement completed before we could resume funding, but we're now getting very close.
So that's the holdup. You don't have that agreement, the new agreement quite finished, and that's why you can't start looking at
the agreement is finished. The agreement is finished, but we are really dedicated to making sure we've got we've done the due diligence and have all of the reporting and paperwork done. So we're very close now to having the first round of disbursements go out the door.
And any guesstimate as to when that might happen?
I'd say in the next few weeks.
Okay. But definitely by the end of the year, would that be safe to say?
Oh, definitely. Yes, definitely by the end of the year. I'd say definitely the restart will happen before the end of October.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Beginning our fourth and final round, Mr. Brock, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to follow up on a couple of loose threads that from questioning of my colleagues, starting with Madame Sinclair I'm going to mispronounce her name, Desgagnés. She asked you whether or not you're in a position to apologize for the mischaracterization of the whistleblower who blew the lid open on this scandal. And I believe your response was simply, that was in the past, I'm part of a new board. So you, as representing the board, governing under SDTC, you are not taking a position to apologize for the state of affairs at this particular corporation. Is that what I'm hearing?
You know, we were brought in to provide strong governance and executive oversight to SDTC. I wasn't in the organization at the time that this witness number one
sorry to interrupt.
was working.
No one has accepted responsibility. No one has apologized for this boondoggle that the assistant deputy minister called on a secret tape, that this was a sponsorship-like scandal, the likes that this country has not seen since the demise of the Chrétien Martin government. We're talking almost $1 billion of taxpayer funds that went out the door that should not have. So if you're not prepared to apologize, I'll keep that on record that you're not prepared to do that because you're part of a new board. Now, my colleague, Mr. Cooper, also asked you a question regarding recovery. And I know you have a mandate with respect to recovery. But what I'm hearing is, despite being 4 months into the job, despite clear evidence from the Ethics Commissioner about violations under the Conflict of Interest Act, with a defined number of money that was improperly dispersed to the former chair, Annette Verschuren, that is evidence. That is conclusive evidence. And I guess what I'm hearing from you is, it's not a priority. It's not a priority for you. It's not a priority for the board, certainly not a priority for this government. So what are you saying to taxpayers?
Point of order, Mr. Chair. I respect my colleague, Mr. Brock, but he's putting words into the witness' mouth without even providing any evidence to this committee. The witness has answered to me that there are investigations currently going on. So I love to follow the evidence, but when we're opining, this is where I question the auditor's ability on the other side to actually get to the bottom of this and find the truth.
The witness can add, while you might find the questions anyhow, Mr. Brock, I've stopped the clock. That is not a point of order. You might be irritated with the style of the question, but it is Mr. Brock's time, and the witness is able, the gentleman and the witness is here to answer questions. Mr. Brock, you have the floor again, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I apologize, ma'am, for the interruptions from the Liberal bench, but they don't like hearing tough questions. I want you to address Canadians, because there are hundreds of thousands of Canadians who are following the scandal, following my social media posts, my colleagues' social media posts about this scandal. What are you saying to Canadians about your priority in terms of ensuring money is paid back? What is the plan?
The plan is to implement the findings of the Auditor General's report of June 2024, and we are well advanced in that work. And that every recommendation has been implemented now except one, and that is we are now reviewing every single project on an individual basis as per her recommendation. And where there are any...
Are you completely disregarding the findings of the Ethics Commissioner, who made a finding of 2 violations under the Conflict of Interest Act with a defined amount? Why is it not a priority for your board, working with the ministry, to recover those funds from Annette Verschuren? Why aren't you doing that?
We are in a process right now.
Doesn't say anything. Process is government speak for take our word for it. We are going to make this a priority when we get to it. You've had 4 months to do something about it. This is a priority for Canadians. It's not a priority to continue the funding. The priority is to get the money back, almost $1 billion of taxpayer funds. That's just not being recovered. No process to recover that. That's a real significant problem. Now, you also mentioned that you complied with the disclosure requests from this committee. Who gave you direction from the ministry to supply all the information as requested?
We received the direction from the law clerk directly to SDTC.
And did I hear directly from you that you complied with each and every request from the law clerk, and these documents were unredacted?
Yes, you heard that correctly.
Okay. And when was it delivered to the law clerk?
Because of the thousands and thousands and thousands of documents that were requested, pretty well every document that's been produced in the organization the last 20 years, it was produced and delivered in tranches. And so every two or three weeks, another 13,000 documents were provided. They were provided over the course of the summer and into, I believe we completed, and I can get you, I don't have the dates in front of me, sir, but we have complied with the request.
Thank you. My last question, when was the last tranche delivered?
I'm now just guessing because I don't have that just on the top of my head, and there's been, I would say it was in early September.
Thank you very much. Mr. Jernay, I appreciate your patience, and I appreciate you swapping the turn. It is noted and thanked by the chair, so over to you, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Doyle, I've asked you when these potential reviews by the third party would be done. You've mentioned a date, December 2024. Just wondering, there's been some mentions about, it's no news to anybody that the Ethics Commissioner has ruled on 2 cases specifically. But if we are to recover any monies, I'm just wondering, what would be the legal risk of you just starting to send letters to those particular companies that may or may not have, because I don't know, I'm still waiting to see the reviews, but that may or may not have done any wrongdoing? What would those companies potentially put the government into Canada? What would be the legal risk?
We have received legal advice and on the whole question of recovery, and the project agreements that we enter into with the recipient companies are legal documents, they're binding documents. So there needs to be, a violation of some aspect of that document for us to recover any funds. But we have been forthright in receiving advice on that. I think one of the risks with some of the very small companies is that to go after them and to recover them might actually cost more money from a legal perspective than it actually bears any fruit for the crown, so to speak. But we are receiving advice on that right now.
But I'm assuming that the legal advice you're receiving is, let's make sure we get all our ducks in a row. Let's make sure the third-party review is completed before we make any conclusions, as my honorable colleague on the other side is making with all the companies, because they're not mentioning any companies, they're just saying everything's been, and they're opining on this stuff. But I do want to get to the bottom of this, get the truth. But in order to get the truth, we have to let the investigation or the process, as the other side seems to be against the process or against the recommendations of the Auditor General now, that I understand, we have to let this particular process do its course.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so once the reviews are completed, you've mentioned December 2024. Will you be, as the board, there will be certain recommendations by the third party in terms of saying, here's where we think there could be more, where you could potentially recover some dollars if the contribution agreements were not respected in terms of achieving the said goals within the contribution agreements. How long do you anticipate that this may take from once the report's received and then the work that will be outlined in the next month or a few months?
Few months, yeah. Well, we are certainly preparing the ground because this is all connected in with the restarting of funding. As I mentioned, we will not restart any funds or unless where there's any finding of wrongdoing or serious non-compliance with the contribution agreement. The timing on this is one that we are operating in a very accelerated fashion. I can't give you an actual date of when that's going to happen, but we are preparing the ground, I can say at this time.
Okay, so is the board thinking about potential scenarios where you've already mentioned one, if it's about recouping, $1,000 or $10,000 and it's going to cost us $20,000 in lawyer fees? Obviously, it would be a bad investment to try and recoup those particular dollars. So are you kind of setting a criteria sheet in terms of, okay, this makes sense to go after the ABC company because there's dollars that important dollars that are involved, and there was important breaches that were involved from the contribution agreement. Like, is the board starting to think about this right now? Is that when you say preparing the groundwork, is that what you guys are thinking
absolutely.
about?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. I think I'm out.
If you have a brief question, I'll allow it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Duray. Et puis encore une fois, Madame Sinclair pour
Ms. Sinclair Desgagnés, 2 minutes 30 seconds. Ms. Boyle, conflicts of interest have been at the center of this saga. We talked about conflict of interest concerning the board of directors, the former board of directors, but also it's increasingly obvious that they might have also concerned consultants and some senior officials. Consultants working on their own and also consultants in firms. We received Cheryl Urey here in this committee who said she was working with Deloitte already and wasn't sure that Deloitte was going to assess eligible companies, as we said before. It wasn't clear. The response was really not clear as to whether a verification of conflict of interest between Deloitte and the companies being audited had to be done. It's very important to clarify that situation and to submit evidence to this committee that there was verification done by the companies that are responsible for assessing eligibility and the companies being verified. That's very important. Can you do that?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. And yes, I can confirm that there is a conflict of interest screen for any consultant working on the eligibility on this under these contracts, and we can provide that as part of the information around this process.
Même quand il s'agit de grands cabinets comme
Even if it's a big company like Deloitte, not just independent consultants?
Yes, yes.
Parfait.
Indeed.
Donc,
Every consultancy working on this, big or small, are subject to a conflict of interest screen.
parfait. Et allez-vous améliorer, comment avez-vous amélioré les processus pour
And how are you going to improve the process to identify any breaches in conflicts of interest, for example, in the minutes of the board of directors meetings? Because one of the main findings was that in the minutes there was no indication as to whether, following a declaration of conflict of interest, the people left the room. So how would the process be changed to make sure that minutes are comprehensive? Now, do you read all the minutes to make sure that they are a true reflection of the meeting?
Yes, we have made a couple of improvements. One of them is that we have an independent recorder of the minutes, like a professional, a lawyer, in fact, who is recording the minutes of the board. At the start of each board meeting, we ask for, is there any conflicts of interest? In times when we are looking at projects specifically, the projects are sent in advance so that there can be a screen. But right now, this small new board of SDTC, we have no conflicts of interest with any clean tech company that has either been funded or being proposed for funding by SDTC.
Et voilà, merci beaucoup.
Your time is up. Thank you. Mr. Desjardins, your last round.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I do want to thank Ms. Doyle again for being present here. I do want to continue in relation to the Auditor General's report. We've spoken about 6.29, something I brought up in the very beginning of our discussion here today, what I believe to be an important process to recover funds. You've been asked several times by my colleagues about that process. I would request, if you may, throughout your continued review of that process, to regularly update this committee, if you can, in relationship to when those new criteria are actually implemented, so that we can review instances where potentially there could be some persons that are deemed ineligible under your new rubric, and those persons, of course, in my mind, should be subject to recovery for taxpayers. That's money that's owed if they're not eligible under the former process, and if they're still not eligible under the new one, we should know about it. Canadians should know that we're in the process of recovery. I want to move to 6.26, which was another partial agree at that time by SDDC in relation to projects that the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development Canada requested that SDDC improve the challenge function over projected sustainable development and environmental benefits. We've seen throughout the process of the audit that some projects, shockingly, I think, to many Canadians, including myself, were dismayed by the fact that projects that didn't have any real benefit for the environment in particular, or innovation that would contribute to the reduction of greenhouse gases, for example, received funding. The purpose of SDDC is to ensure that we have innovation towards economic and environmental improvement. There was instances that was discovered by the Auditor General where that failed to happen, that did not happen. It makes sense that the Environmental Commissioner is asking for improved challenge functions. How do you respond to 6.26 of the Auditor General's report? Oh, sorry, Ms. Doyle, you're just on mute.
Yeah, I agree with you that this is a really important part of the mandate. And we, as part of 6.29 and the review of eligibility, one of the eligibilities that is being verified are the environmental benefits of each project. And so I do know that there has been an improvement in the quantification of environmental benefits from projects under review. But I can assure you that under the eligibility review process underway now, that environmental benefits is one of the explicit eligibility that is being checked by 2 independent consultants.
Thank you very much. Up next, Mr. Nader for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you, thank you to Ms. Doyle for joining us this afternoon. I want to start off with a bit of a request. Would you be willing to share with this committee copies of the minutes of all board meetings and investment committee meetings for the audit period from March 1st, 2019, right up to today? Is that something you could provide this committee with?
Yes, and I understand that those have already been provided under the production of papers request, like all of the minutes, because we're going back now to 2017, sir. But
just to interrupt, thank you. But I'm asking directly to this committee, not
directly. Yes,
to this committee.
Yeah,
you could
to this
commit
committee.
to do that within a reasonable time period, which the chair and the clerk could work that out. A second thing I wanted to follow up on, it's been mentioned a few times, the non-disclosure agreements which current and former employees have been required to sign. Is this something that you would be willing to withdraw those NDAs and allow all current and past employees to speak freely? Is that something you as a board member would be willing to undertake?
You know, we have a very specific mandate that's been provided to us as kind of on this transitionary period. So I would take that under advisement. I can't make any commitment on that right now, and I'm not sure that it is appropriate. Some of those NDAs were entered into because of a particular severance on the departure of employees from SDTC. That's my understanding in the past. So I think I would have to open up the whole thing, but I can't make that undertaking right now.
So I will leave that point for now, but I do know we have other directors who are coming, and I think this is an issue that you as a board member will have to deal with, and I think it is something that would be in the interest of transparency, that those who have been eager to speak but unable to do so because of these NDAs which SDTC have placed on them have been unable to do so. So I will come back to that, but I think you should be strongly considering that. I want to move on quickly to this review of the projects that's being undertaken. In response to a question from Ms. Bradford, you did say that you would provide this committee with that information, but then you made a bit of a caveat, subject to certain commercial confidentiality. Now, you have served as a deputy minister of a federal department, so you, I'm sure, are aware that committees can request any information without limitations. You are aware of that, right?
Yes, I think I do recall that. Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify because whenever I hear stipulations being placed on subject to this, subject to that, the power of committees to send for documents is without restriction, and so I did want to clarify that. So we do look forward to receiving that information when it is finished. Now I've got about a couple minutes left. I want to go back a little bit in time because there's an interesting quirk of history. The last time you appeared before this committee was dealing with another energy and clean energy issue when you were the Deputy Minister of NRCan, dealing with a period between 2003 and 2005 when the former Liberal government came under conflict of interest challenges. And that's ethics commission, or that's a AG report. It was written that before signing the 5 contribution agreements, NRCan knew that a consultant who had provided services to the department relating to the contribution programs would also be working for the organizations that received NRCan funding under these programs. In our view, the AG's view, this is a conflict of interest that NRCan did not identify. Payments totaling about $3.2 million that NRCan made under the contribution agreement with CEEA Transport were not in accordance with the terms and conditions of this agreement. Now, granted, you were not the Deputy Minister at the time that Liberal government was undertaking this program, but you were the Deputy Minister when the audit came out. I'm just looking at these 2 AG reports, looking at these conflicts of interest. Why is it, Ms. Doyle, that SDTC was able to operate under such terrible conflict of interest challenges when we've seen these challenges happening before with a former Liberal government. Why did this happen once again? Liberals back in power going back to their old ways of allowing these conflict of interests to get back into the play of things. Money going to friends, going to those who are in conflicts of interest. Why did this happen? From your expert view.
Well, let me just say that you've got a very good memory, or somebody who's a good researcher, because that is exactly when the last time I was back in front of this committee. And at the time it was, I can only say that it was in the one of the research labs. It was an individual in a research lab that didn't really have any kind of a political affiliation from what I can recall.
Thank you very much. And our final member, Ms. Khalid, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you again, Ms. Doyle. You've been here for a long time, and I really appreciate your patience and your calmness in answering all of our questions. We really do appreciate it. My understanding is that you have appeared during the former Prime Minister Stephen Harper's time, and so I find it quite telling that all the opposition is trying to do is to find ways to link this to a Liberal government, any Liberal government that has been current or in the past. But I do want to talk to you about what the impact of that maligning, that constant questioning, that constant needling into what is democratic institutions and that public trust. So, can you help us understand what the impact of this has been on the industry? After a year of frozen funding at SDTC, what exactly are you hearing from the industry in your 4 months in your position?
Well, I certainly feel that what the industry would like to see is us get back to business and get back to the mission of advancing clean tech innovation in Canada. And the pause has had an impact on individual companies who are, have their work suspended or on pause because of the funding pause. But I think by and large, there is a feeling that this is a really important sector and that it is important for SDTC has been an important partner, over the last 20 years in clean tech, and has seen some significant results, successes come out of that. So I do think that the industry is just anxious, whether it be an SDTC or NRC, for Canada to get on with promoting and supporting the evolution of clean tech in this country.
Thank you. And to be clear, the minister, once he identified this entire thing as an issue, took action. And now, as we're going through the transition process, what are what is the outlook for that industry to ensure that we are supporting that industry as we transition to the NRC from the SDTC?
I think that the prospects are fairly strong, and we are. I've learned again, or kind of gotten back into understanding just the strength of the clean tech sector in Canada, and many of our I guess partners and recipients are making real progress in advancing the sustainability of every kind of sector across the country. It's impressive, the diversity of projects that are being funded, from the agricultural sector, transportation, in oil and gas, in consumer, all areas. So I think it is a fairly strong. It's a sector that deserves public investment.
And why is that, do you think?
Well, just to stay competitive globally, like many other countries are investing in their clean tech sectors, and it is, it's not only a question of strengthening the sustainability of it, it's also of the economic prospects. Yes, it's just really, it's really important in terms of the economy of this century.
realize that you've only been in your role for 4 months, and that's not a very long time. I'm sure you're still trying to catch the ropes. But I do want to know what is your vision, say 10 years from now, with respect to how the NRC is going to function, and where you see this industry going, and where it will lead Canada globally.
You know, I have to say that since taking on this role, we've had little opportunity for imagining the future. Just because there's a lot of work to be done in implementing the AG's report and, you know, the within our mandate. But I do feel optimistic, you know, in what I've learned about the partner companies that STTC is supporting. I feel optimistic around the level of innovation in the sector, and I see it as fairly bright. And I'm sure the NRC will serve it well.
Thank you very much again, Ms. Doyle, for your time today and for your expertise. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Ms. Khalid. And thank you, Ms. Doyle, for your testimony and participation in relation to the study. You can send in any of the requested materials to the clerk. If you have any questions, please raise them with the clerk. I will say, I'm just going to make 2 points just to kind of set things off. I know at one point with Madame Desjardins, she'd asked for some documents, and you said you would review that, I think take it under advisement. Where's that effect? If you could let us know, I always encourage as much disclosure as possible. I realize sometimes it can be tricky. I would just remind you that Parliament does have, this committee as well as Parliament does have the ability to call for documents, although we don't go 0 to 60 overnight. Should you feel you cannot provide documents, you could please provide an explanation why that is the case. But again, I would urge you to side on the side, or to fall on the side of transparency and openness. As well, we generally like to have a response back within 3 weeks, please, if that's possible. Sooner, again, is always preferred, but we'll begin to sniff around for the documents within 3 weeks and begin to ask questions. So I appreciate that. I just wanted to raise that with you. So again, thank you very much, Ms. Doyle, and I will adjourn the committee. We're out of resources. We'll see you back here Monday. The notice is going out very soon.